I wanted to give you just a word of background for those of you who don't know the most recent story of the Thomas Mann House, which is that it was being sold as a tear-me-down. Some good people in the United States brought it to the attention of the German Foreign Office with incredible speed. They made the decision to preserve the house, restore it, and establish it as a residence for scholars and other thinkers about urgent contemporary issues from Germany, to give them a chance to be in the United States and to interact with their colleagues here and also with audiences across the country. At the Thomas Mann House itself, which is just a residence, it will continue to be a residence. Public programs will engage in working with other institutions in Los Angeles, especially with the Goethe Institutes, but we have conversations already at USC and UCLA and UC Irvine, and we'll reach broader than that, much broader than that. I am so aware of our shortness of time. So I'm going to save the other thank yous for later, except to thank our first partners here at the Getty, James Kuno, the president of the J. Paul Getty Trust, Thomas Getkins, who was then head of the Getty Research Institute and who embraced the project immediately, as did Jim Kuno, and Andrew Perchuk, who carried forward during the transition when Thomas returned to Germany. We will now turn, well, that's enough background. So we'll turn to our first panel, and I will invite up, he's in dark print, Helmut Anheier, to introduce the panel and to carry us forward. Helmut, thank you.
Yes, good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Helmut Anheier. I'm the Dean and President of the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. And I was for many happy years a resident of this city and a professor at UCLA, and I have very good memories of this part of the world and the institution as well. And I was very honored when I was asked to chair this panel and to moderate this panel this morning. I will now briefly introduce our panelists and ask them to join me here, and then I will say a few introductory remarks, and then we will hear two opening statements by our first two panelists. The first panelist is Jutta Allmendinger. She's the president of the Science Center in Berlin, and she's also a recipient of one of the first Thomas Mann Fellows. And I would like you to join me on stage. Welcome, Jutta. Yeah. And our second panelist is Marcelo Suárez-Orozco. He's the dean of the UCLA School of Education. Welcome, Marcelo. And then I think we really have to thank the organizers for making it possible that we not only have the two distinguished professors here with us, but also two graduate students. We have two graduate students from UCLA, and I welcome Diane Allen and Roman Flores. Now that we're complete, let me say a few introductory remarks before turning giving the word to Jutta. In 1938, Thomas Mann wrote an essay, The Coming Victory of Democracy. And you have to reflect on this a bit, because 1938 was, of course, not a time where democracy was celebrating many victories around the world. It was almost the opposite. But it's still so much worth reading that essay. And I just refer to two aspects of the many deep insights that Thomas Mann had when he wrote the essay. And by the way, he traveled through the United States giving a lecture or giving lectures based on that essay. He writes that democracy should be defined as that form of government and of society which above all is inspired by a deep respect of the dignity of humankind. And it is interesting, and that is already part of what we will discuss in this panel, that we link democracy not only to a form of government, but also to a form of society. And if you then look at the first article of the German Constitution, there it says, and that's the first sentence in the German Constitution, human dignity is inviolable. And to anticipate that in these very dark years and the many brutal years that followed is quite remarkable. But then democracy did indeed thrive. Right? If you look at recent decades, and particularly until about the turn of the century, Thomas Mann was right. We had more democracies than we ever had before, and more people lived in democracies than ever before. However, Thomas Mann, in the same essay, also cautions us that we should never take democracy for granted. He writes that a democracy and a democratic government requires a democratically inspired society, and vice versa. And with that, he hints at many of the issues that we today are struggling with. Aspects of social cohesion, aspects of citizenship. And in our panel today, we will also look at migration. Right? What kind of society welcomes what kind of migrants, and what is the democratic order around that? But Thomas Mann says democracy is more than a form of government. Democracy is government and a society inspired by respect of human dignity. Today, we would add aspects such as social cohesion and citizenship. And with that, I would like to turn to Jutta Allmendinger, our first panelist, and ask her to reflect on what are some of the deeper factors that are behind the democratic malaise we experience today in many of the advanced countries of the West. So she will look beyond to everyday politics and beyond the current administration and beyond the current debates that we have in Europe, and will address some of the underlying issues. Jutta, the word is yours.
Thank you very, very much. First, please let me express my really enthusiasm for being the first generation of this Thomas Mann House, and say a deep thank you for all who picked me. I didn't apply, and it was the most wonderful phone call I got in 2017. So thanks a lot. And to whomever, appeals what I'm going to say or what this panel has to say, please write me an email. You easily find me, and then I have the opportunity to get in touch with you, which is what I want to achieve in the coming 4 months. I'm starting at the 1st of August. With this having said, thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, we are talking about migration in particular, but I first want to broaden our view and make the point that the topic of today's session, diversity and the search for common ground, is on much more than migration and integration of refugees. It's all about getting along with increasing social inequality. And increasing social inequality we see in Germany in particular in terms of wealth. We do not see that we educate our people properly, so we still have 20% of our inhabitants in Germany who do not have an occupational training and therefore do not really have a future in the labor force. We also are not there where we want to be in terms of gender. So this social inequality is most certainly one line of a huge divide, and this divide gets bigger over time. The other divide is quite unrelated, and this is a divide in terms of attitudes of those people who believe in what we call communitarism. So they believe in their local or probably national identity, which is the most important thing for them, clear barriers around their local or their national borders. And on the other hand, we have people who believe in what we call cosmopolitan. So those people believe in global interaction, that we need to open our border, that we have not only to be Europeans, but also citizens of the world. Now, if we look in many, many studies whether social inequality goes along with the attitudes of communitarism or cosmopolitanism, this is not the case. Just looking at the recent election in Germany and looking who voted for the alternative for Germany, AfD, we see that people who are very well educated are more or less equally electing this party as people with a poor education. And we also see it in terms of income. So this is not a one-to-one, and this makes us wonder what are the forces behind it. Last year, I published a book which I called The Testimony of Germany, or in another way, I mean, I was asking the question, what kind of Germany you really want to see in the next generation? So they are not only giving me their answers on what is important for them today, but also what they want to be important in the future. Given this study, there were two major conclusions. The first conclusion was that all people of those 3,010 which I asked in the age of 14 to 80, whether they were women or men living in East or West Germany, all of them wanted to have a sense of feeling together, feeling, being on a common ground, as the title says today. But they also expressed that they indeed lack this common ground for several reasons. They lack it because our cities become more and more segregated. Probably they are not as segregated as American cities are, and this is one of my research topics, along with replicating this study which I did in Germany, in Los Angeles this year. But they are getting more and more segregated according to lines, according to the line of age, interestingly enough, and according to the line of socioeconomic status. Not, at least not the big cities in Germany, according to ethnic lines, because it really matters whether a person coming from another country is well educated or not. So ethnic lines we do not see to the same extent. The other big thing which happens in Germany is that the workforce is getting more and more segregated in those jobs in which people sort of think that they can survive without going in further training, learning a second occupation, and those who know that they won't survive, who see that digitalization made huge progress and that the jobs which they are doing right now in this very moment will disappear. And the third, of course, and this is something which you know very, very well, is an increasing segregation of our schools. Our schools have now expanded in Germany, a huge private sector, which is probably not the worst thing. I'm not against private schools in general, but they get 80% of the money from public sources, and they are not doing what they are supposed to do by law, that they do not pick the best people given the money which they bring into those schools. So they are considered to pick people who have the competencies to join those schools. This is not what's happening in the moment. What actually worries me most is that we have schools exclusively composed by migrants or refugees. And many, many studies being done in Germany, but also in the US, show that heterogeneous composition of schools is what helps all students, not just those students coming from other countries. And we are not really going in this direction. We are not training our teachers to deal with this increasing heterogeneity, with dealing with the different languages that are spoken, with dealing with the different social backgrounds which students bring in. And this is not simply related to early school or grammar school, it's also related to further training, where we have this huge divide. I could come up with further things which over the time we simply lost. We had military service which brought together people from different strata. We had a compulsory civil service which brought together people from different areas, and we do not have this common ground anymore. We do not have the city spaces where people mingle. We don't have the schools where people from different socio-economic background meet. We do not have, compulsory civil service, for example, where people meet. So why do I think it's so important that people meet in real time and not just on social media? We know by many studies which we have taken, and many studies psychologists do, that only meeting in person, being able to talk to each other, has the force to decrease stereotypes. And our stereotyping is the worst thing which undermines our common ground, and therefore, if I follow Thomas Mann, also the possibility to live in a democratic country. So we stay without our own zones increasingly. We do not talk to each other. We are not even shopping in the same malls anymore if we are not ordering our food by people who bring the food at home. And this loss is something which worries me more, this loss of social cohesion, and this impossibility, if you want to consider it like this, of forming of now in German, a Gesellschaft to a Gemeinschaft, or forming from a society, a community, which means, and I consider it as a source of democracy. So the question is then, what can be done? Most certainly, the increase of social media does not step in, because whatever we're doing in terms of research, in particular using social media, we even stay more in our comfort zones. So I'm twittering with him, or I'm emailing with Helmut Anheier, but not with other people whom I don't know. So this is not a way out. In the opposite, this at least are the statistics and is the research we know. So I think that we have to indeed work primarily on our schools, early on, to reduce stereotypes, to bring different people together. And in doing this, we have to invest more money in schools, considerably more money. And we have to invest new curricula, we have to develop them. It's not just that education is training for the labor force. Education clearly is something which enhances humanity, which increases respect in other people. So this is which we have to take on the forefront in particular, because what you need in the labor market changes so often that school is probably not the only way to learn what you are considered to know. The other thing is that we really have to invest in different cities. In Germany, at least, we have the social houses in areas which are poor. We have to have social housing in middle-class areas. We have to do a lot in this direction, and probably in the discussion we can move on and asking what else can be done to bring people together, to increase social cohesion, and to reduce stereotyping, which is the worst we can do if we really want to stay at heterogeneity combined with respect towards others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jutta. You rightly pointed to the importance of institutions that generate social cohesion. And I think it's either the absence or the malfunctioning of some of those institutions that are behind the democratic problems that we face in many societies, by people not voting, by people not engaging, and people, in fact, feeling excluded from society. Now, migration, and the issue of migration, is a very central topic. It's very close to social cohesion. And the United States, of course, understands or understood itself as a country of migration. But it also has been a very complicated and a highly contested issue, going back to the beginnings of the Republic. Now, Germany doesn't really understand itself as a migration society where people migrate to. But when you look at the statistics, you find that Germany has about the same share of migration or migrants relative to population than the United States has. And Germany is becoming increasingly diverse, as is the United States. It's becoming diverse because of migration. Now, we have Marcelo with us, who is an anthropologist. An anthropologist by training are comparativists, right? They compare societies. And if we were to ask you, Marcelo, to tell us, what do you see as the differences and the similarities of migration in the United States and migration in Germany? And what are some of the lessons learned, looking at history?
Thank you so much. First, I'm deeply honored to share in this conversation. I'm grateful to Stephen and to Nikolai, to my colleagues in the panel, for this opportunity to commence once again a dialogue I've had over the last almost 20 years with German colleagues, with German academics, on issues relating to democracy, the demographic transformation that is unfolding in the United States and throughout Western Europe. This is a conversation that I began at the Goethe Institute when Rita Susmuth asked me to join her. I was at Harvard at that time, and we began a wonderful series of exchanges with our colleagues in Germany, the Bertelsmann Foundation, and currently we have a major initiative with colleagues at Hildesheim University on the preparation of teachers working with immigrant and refugee children. So I'd like to make three basic points. One, on the comparative method. The second point on history and its lessons. And the third point on the future and moving forward. First, a note on the comparative method. We can learn a great deal from our German colleagues about the nature of the deep echo, the demographic changes taking place in Germany and in the United States signify for moving forward. It's as my colleague presented in her very precise and eloquent discourse, we can think of Germany and the United States, to paraphrase the beautiful eternal first line in Tolstoy, Anna Karenina, all families are happy the same way, but each family is unhappy in its own way. What I see as the fundamental difference, and I start with the situation in the United States, is the unhappiness that flows from a very large, a very significant, persistent matter of the undocumented population of the United States. Today, there are 11 million human beings in our country living in the shadows of the law. the humanitarian collapse at the US southern border with the forceful, violent removal of children from their mother's arms is simply a barbaric reminder of a much larger problem we have in our country that flows from 11 million folk that are living their lives de facto as members of the family of the nation. They worship in our churches, they work alongside with us, they make our beds, they feed us in our schools, but de jure, they're not members of the family of the nation. I would say that this is a dynamic that separates the German current context, the malaise in Germany, qua immigration and the refugee status, and the issues facing the United States today. I think in Germany, of course, the challenge will be connecting with the large and growing sector of the German population that now is refugee and immigrant origin. As Helmut said, the levels of migration are really quite similar as a percent of the population. Similarities, I think that my colleague identified, I think, 2 or 3 issues that are central. First, the issue of segregation. We have one of the leading scholars in the world on this topic, Professor Gary Orfield, my colleague, who has done the fundamental research. Segregation is never equal. The issues that flow from the distance between populations are many, and they were brilliantly enumerated by my colleague. So this is a point where we see our families unhappy the same way. The issue of segregation is it's the elephant in the classroom in American schools and increasingly, we just learned from our colleague, in German schools. So that is an important point. Another point of similarity is the transformational value of education. When the Greeks invented the idea of education as a public good, the fundamental idea was the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, the flourishing of the child to her full potential. Connectivity to the labor market, the way politicians talk about education, is a piece, but maybe not the defining piece. When the great John Dewey wrote what is one of the most important books of the 20th century, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the publication of Democracy and Education, Dewey viewed education as fundamentally a tool of citizenship. And maybe his most famous phrase, he said, education is not preparation for the future. Education is life. Without lifelong learning, citizenship withers. And I think that part of the malaise, part of the dystopia our colleague identified may flow from these problems, fundamental problems in education. So that's the comparative side. Now the historical side. You know, Kierkegaard said, we live looking forward, but we only understand looking backwards. In my field of immigration, there is a fundamental law. We love immigrants looking backwards. In the here and now, there is always the same panic. This is the panic that led Benjamin Franklin to, in all his wisdom, announce Germans will never become Americans. They're going to Germanize us. We are not going to Anglicize them. Historic words. The near panic that the Italians and the Irish and the Germans generated 100, 120 years ago mimics the current response that flows from the reptilian brain. It doesn't flow from the better angels of our nature. But the structure of the anxiety history teaches us is very, very similar. Today, we know what the concerns are. The concerns echo through the ages. The third point, I think, is the most important point, and that is Germany and the United States are now countries where, in the US, immigration is history and destiny. It's the story of how the country came to be in its present form, the arrival of the first peoples 10,000 years ago, the involuntary transfer of African slaves, the mass migration of Europeans, the great transatlantic journey. From the end of the Napoleonic Wars into the first decade of the 20th century, Europe sent 60 million souls to the New World. And up to very, very recently, German Americans represented the largest immigration ancestry in American history. Today, it is Mexicans. And my condolences to the German team for... I'm neutral because I'm Argentine, so... Viva Mexico. So, the piece on history is very, very significant because I've been in the field of immigration for 30 years. I was a young doctoral student. We're now going to turn to the future. And my advisor at Berkeley told me, Marcelo, you're a smart kid. This is 35 years ago. Don't go into immigration. It's a non-field. There's nothing to study there. The prophetic words of professors. The future moving forward is one where the only sector of the population now growing in Germany, in the United States, in Canada, in Sweden, in Italy, in New Zealand, in Australia, is the immigrant origin sector. Here in Los Angeles, California, half of the children that got up this morning to go to school come from immigrant-headed households. Half of the children in the state of California. In Germany, moving forward, all the growth will be dominated by the immigrant and the refugee origin sector of the population. We did a very interesting project with the Bertelsmann Foundation. Germany is a country of 82 million people today. You do the math, one model, 20 years, 40 years. Beyond that, as Massimo Levi-Vacci, the greatest demographer alive at the Collège de France says, then you move from science to science fiction. The growth will be in our country, in Germany, throughout Western Europe, will be the immigrant origin population. It is the children. It is the future. Connecting with immigrant origin children is the existential challenge facing the United States and Germany. Meaning, without a happy future, without a eudaimonic future for our immigrant origin, the immigrant origin children we share, to borrow a phrase from Professor Oganda at UCLA, there isn't a happy future. California is today the 5th largest economy in the world. 75% of the kids in LAUSD are Hispanic, immigrant, or the children of immigrants. You can't remain the 5th largest economy in the world if you don't connect with the immigrant origin population. So we go back to Tolstoy, although we're celebrating the incomparable Thomas Mann. How do we connect with the newest German citizens, with the newest American citizens? Without that, there can't be a happy future for our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. You identified the importance of education and what education does or does not do at the moment about the topic of migration. And we have two graduate students from UCLA here, and welcome again. And I would ask you basically the same question, and Diane, you may reflect on it first. Of course, I think you're also an immigrant to this country, as I am, and we have an immigrant experience, and you, however, did another choice. You made another choice. You study education and you focus on migration. What made you do so, and what fascinates you about the topic of migration, and why did you go to a school of education and not to a school of public policy or the economics department at UCLA?
Well, again, thank you for having me. For me, simply because I am an immigrant, I understand the importance of being a part of the conversation of education and being someone who is inside of that, recognizing and bringing the voice back into spaces like research, back into spaces of higher level where I can actually lend my voice to policymakers and our researchers to say, hey, this is what's happening on the ground with our students. This is what they're needing. I work specifically in the after-school space because I believe that there is so much that happens outside of school that I have to do as a complement. And I think because so much is missing, it's trying to always bring it together. So the interest of education and immigration is just an important intersection, not only because of my story, because simply, as Ardeen said, the intersection and the kind of numbers that we have in a city like California, in a city like Los Angeles, it's always just important to bring that, put that on the table. That's central for me at this time.
So very grateful to be here, as a young scholar participating in this dialogue about migration throughout the world, especially in Germany and the United States, and what we can learn from each other. In terms of personally, I do identify as a second-generation person of Mexican origin. My parents immigrated as young adults into this country to seek, for the primary reason for a lot of immigrant families is for economic and educational opportunities. So that's a source of inspiration for me to pursue this type of work, and like Diane was saying, is inform research and policy and laws that can represent a more democratic society where there's more fair or equal representation of voices, but also values that are rooted in culture.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd like to ask Jutta a question, or you can also comment on what we've just heard.
May I first ask a question?
Yes,
Thank you. When you talk that you said you focus primarily on the after-school space and time, so what do you do exactly? What are you studying there?
Well, currently what I do in my daytime apart from school is that I am the program director of an after-school, nonprofit after-school program, and we focus specifically on single-parent, low-income families, and a primarily large group of that is from Hispanic origin. And so it is knowing and being rooted into their culture, like you said, and the values, we just brought up values, like what are the value systems that they have been ingrained in, and how are they matching that into becoming American and going into the school system and trying to, make academic strides and try and understand themselves in the space. We're having all those things happening. I think we just operate as a complement to be able to be a voice and a listening, an ear to them to say, okay, what is your experience? How can we assist you as someone who has been here, even if it's longer, to say, here's the path, here's something that you can do. I understand where you are. Let me walk you in a direction where you can find success, because similar to Ramon, our parents may not have had a model. They're coming in from whatever country they're coming from, and that model may not work here. So I think it's just a privilege to be a guide in that way, to show them a route towards successfully integrating and being a part and a contribution to the society that they now live in.
So this is an intervention study which you do for your PhD?
Not currently.
Well, along with this question.
It's in formulation. It's in formulation.
Okay, no problem at all. The question I had, in fact, it's to both of you, Jutta and Marcelo. One big difference between the United States and Germany when it comes to immigration is, you might say, the narrative that comes with it. And in the United States, there's a certain ideology that is sometimes referred to as the American dream, right? So you come to America and you're a dishwasher for the first 2 years, and you end up being a millionaire. And of course, we all know that's really not true, right? But it still functions as a very important narrative, and it shields this country at the same time to address many inequalities that it has, because there's the ideology of a level playing field. And now Germany has not anything compared to this narrative of the American dream. Do you think Germany would need one? Do you see an advantage of it?
I'm not sure whether you're right, actually. Because when I did this study, I was always asking 3 different questions. So the first 2 questions I already mentioned is, what is important for you, yourself? How do you envision the world you live in? The second question is the testimony. So what do you expect from the next generation? So your norms and values. And the third question was, what do you think how Germany will be really like in the future? And in particular, people with a migrant background were extremely positive about the future. They were saying, well, I earn much less, I'm not working in the occupation I have learned back in my home country, but I accept this, given that my children will have a better future. So they envision a much, much better future than Germans without migration background do. So there is something like a dream which is not in the German narrative. But if you look, and I studied more than 1,000 of those people with migration background, they most certainly have the dream, and they have this optimism, which actually Germany also may need necessarily.
That's basically good news. Marcelo.
Yes, the OECD data, the Education Directorate is actually headed by a very eminent German scholar, Andreas Schleider. I was just with the OECD on the data for the PISA countries, for the OECD countries. And the data show that immigrant origin children tend to have a more optimistic view about the future. Now, in terms of the broader indicators, if we look at the main mechanisms for the transition of immigrant origin populations to new societies, the story overall, with the bracket of the real serious issue with the undocumented origin population in the United States, is the data are reveal a very positive picture. If you take the 3 main instruments by which societies can measure degrees of success in integrating new immigrants. Immigrants in the United States today the children of immigrants are learning English faster and better than immigrants from Germany or from Italy or from Japan did 100 years ago. The data on this are very, very clear. Furthermore, one of my colleagues once said, the US, have become a cemetery for languages. Germans brought German, the beautiful language of Thomas Mann and of Goethe. Italians brought the beautiful language of Dante Alighieri, although Dante spoke Tuscan. He didn't speak Italian. Tuscan became Italian, really. And they brought Japanese, all of these languages disappeared in the United States. So if we look at patterns of language acquisition, a concern of many that this is a fundamental instrument for social cohesion, a common language. Immigrants are learning English today faster and better than they did 100 years ago. Furthermore, the attrition of the home languages remains very, very strong. Like the German-American children of the 3rd generation, the Cuban children in Florida cannot have breakfast in Spanish with their grandmother. It's just a massive language loss and gravitation towards English language. Connectivity with the labor market, the data on this are overwhelming. Immigrants, especially the unauthorized, have a very muscular connectivity with work. They're here for two reasons. As Freud reminded us, the formula for a happy life, love and work. They're here for love, family reunification, and work. So in the second index of the social process of transition, very, very good news. On the third index, which is really the matter of marriage, and are we finding endogamic communities that are circling themselves off, or is the exogamic principle in marriage what determines the course of immigrant integration into the United States? The data on this are overwhelming. Immigrants in the United States today, like they have in the past, are gravitating towards an exogamic pattern of marriage choice. This may be one of the instruments to subvert the terrible endurance of segregation in the United States. If you're a Puerto Rican in New York City today, about 40% in the first generation will marry outside the group. Asian Americans have the largest outmarriage pattern of all immigrant groups coming into the United States. So if you look at language, if you look at connectivity with the labor market, if you look at issues relating to marriage, endogamy, exogamy, you see very, very positive signs. What I find truly amazing is the disconnect between how immigration lives in the public imaginary and the realities of immigration as ascertained by the basic facts. I know that it's very naive to talk about facts and data and rationality in the 21st century.
I stand up for my data. I mean, why should I apologize for being an empiricist?
I was being sarcastic.
Yeah, but I'm not. I mean...
The point that I was trying to make is that the disconnect between what the data show and the way immigration lives in the public imaginary is at an all-time high.
But is it also not, is it true or not, you're the expert, that participation of immigrant groups, recent immigrant groups in elections, once it becomes citizen, is it lower or is it higher than for the resident population? Because one of the problems in American democracy is, of course, the low voter turnout, right? Have you thought about this this issue? Let's say for the Mexican community in Los Angeles, do they participate politically the same way as the Anglo community does? And I should also say that this is the last round we take, and perhaps each of you can comment on this quickly. We will have to break at 12 sharp, and that's in a few minutes. And then we have a coffee break. I was asked to announce that, which I've done. And with this, perhaps, Ramon, do you want to start? And then we go to Jutta, and we end with Jutta. Yeah.
In terms of the exact empirical statistics, I know to a lesser extent, the Mexican-American voter turnout is less compared to the more white American population. And I think there's several source factors because, due to this. One of them is, and I know Dr. Allmendinger touched on this in terms of social cohesion and negative stereotypes in terms of the public consciousness or public imagination that's going on. And the installation of fear to go out and vote and the importance of that in terms of that equal representation of voices and also values and democracy. But in terms of the sources of that, we can think about democracy and civic engagement not occurring right now in the present, but it occurs throughout development and the conditioning of that. So one of the things we've talked about is the importance of education and the importance of the coexistence of the immigrant and non-immigrant students in there. And in terms of kind of turning it back to social cohesion and the implications of that in the future is there's different ways and mechanisms to facilitate this cultural integration of these different groups. For example, one of the things Marcelo was talking about was cross-marriage, cross races and ethnicities. But I believe there should be a purposeful efforts to mix schools that are racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically segregated. I think the purpose in doing that is to bridge that empathy gap and to combat these negative stereotypes. In doing so, because it facilitates a promotion and an appreciation of multiculturalism, which in turn might lead to an increase in social belonging or social cohesion, and in turn might, probably increase the probability of these minority groups having a better turnout in terms of voting and civic engagement and having a greater voice in democracy.
Thank you. Jutta.
Well, I'm usually a very optimistic and positive person, but here I have to finish. I'm really sorry for 2 points which are not really an optimistic outview. And the first one is that looking at German data, I cannot paint this bright colored picture. I mean, I look at immigrants from the first generation. They are not in the occupations they are trained for in their home countries. They earn considerably less. They face considerably discrimination. This is what all studies show. So if we send, and we just did it at my institute, we sent close to 10,000 letters out, just changing a little bit the face of you to his face, and otherwise all qualifications are the same, and you would have been invited to give a job presentation, and he would not, or his likelihood would be extremely lower. So this is pure discrimination because the competencies on the application are very much the same. It's getting not really better in the second generation. Where it is getting better is in the third generation. But this takes time, and I don't think that we'll have the time. The second thing which really drives me around a lot is coming back to my own study. This is a panel study which I'm going to repeat here for Germany, but in part I also start the first wave in Los Angeles, why I'm the lucky person to be here for 4 months. In the second wave, which we finished last year, this optimism, how the world in the future will be like decreased. And it decreased when I asked those people, because I did many of those interviews myself, and I said, well, why are you less optimistic than you have been a year ago? They referred to all the bad talking on our refugees, all the crimes, and all those things. So they told me I felt like a person who belongs to Germany, who is in one way or the other accepted. Also, I'm not on equal footing. But what's going to happen is a massive exclusion of the respect people bring towards me, although last year I have been a citizen as anybody else. So, and we have to be very, very clear and aware that what the media is doing and many of us is doing, and this probably refers to the last point you were making, is really not just hurting the refugees, but is hurting all those people who have been integrated, being here in the first, second, or third generation.
Yeah, very good point. Diana, you almost have the last word.
I think for me, diversity matters, and I think voice matters. I think about traveling, how fascinated we are with traveling across the entire world. It's like, oh, let's visit this place, let's learn how they live, let's learn how they work, let's experience their food. And yet, when we come back to our own country, we're not as willing to be able to experience it and accept it with the same kind of love and the same kind of compassion, just experiencing the world as humans. And I think what we need to remember is that we are humans at the end of the day, and everything that we use to divide us is things that we make up, and for a variety of reasons. But I think when I look into the eyes of children, I just remember that, and I think that's why I stay close to them. And so I think about their futures. I think about working with their parents, and just that a country will benefit so much more if we give everyone that we actually have already welcomed into our doors the tools to add, as opposed to creating structures to keep them suppressed and then complain about them being a burden. We're not positioning ourselves as a community, as a human community, to move forward. And so if we want to think about a bright future, we need to think about how can we equip all our members of society to have a voice, to participate, and to move all of us forward together. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, Diane, you've given the perfect closing comment for this panel. But I'd like to thank all panelists for focusing also on the positive aspects and what we can learn moving forward. And I think the media play a very, very important role in not playing into the hands of the populists and getting negative messages out in our society.
And the panelist also wants to thank you for being an excellent moderator.